In the name of God, the most gracious and compassionate. There exist many arguments for God's existence. One of the famous arguments is the argument from design. The proponents of this argument claim that the complexity we see in the different parts of this world, especially in living things, is a mark of intentional design. For example, they will infer the existence of a designer from the complexity they see in a human eye or a bird's wing. If the complexity of the kind we find in a camera is an evidence of its inventor, they say, how can the complexity we find in a human eye not count as an evidence of a designer? And if the wing of an aeroplane is a sign of clever engineering, how can the wing of a bird not count as an evidence of a more capable architect? This easy argument is universally accepted across different religions, and in the eyes of many, it is one of the last standing in the strong winds of atheism. It is therefore not surprising that many atheists seek to undermine it with scientific and philosophical counter-arguments. In this video, we look closely at one of the famous philosophical counter-arguments that was popularized by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. Dawkins argues that creation does not need a designer any more than a god does. If creation is said to need a designer, so too must God be said to need a designer. This is because a god would have to be more complex than his creation. Who then designed the designer? Dawkins famously asks.
The God hypothesis is a bad answer to the question of how the universe came into being. It doesn't explain anything because it simply pushes back a stage the problem of where the great complexity comes from. A divine creator would have to be supremely complex. If you're going to say God is supremely simple, then you're not talking about God at all in any meaningful sense of the word.
As you can see, Dawkins claims that a god cannot be simple and without complexity. A god must be supremely complex, more complex than this world he originated. But if the supreme complexity of a god can exist without a causal explanation, why should the lesser complexity of this world have an external explanation? In this way, Dawkins challenges the very soundness of the argument from design. In his opinion, design cannot be predicated on complexity. Predicating design on complexity would lead to an infinite regression, for the designer would have to be more complex than his creation. The first thing that comes to mind about this false argument is that it conflicts with common sense and what is known by necessity. If Dawkins were to take his argument to its full conclusions, no amount of complexity in anything, an aeroplane, a camera, even a pencil, would be explained by a designer. If the greater complexities in this world can exist without a designer, the lesser complexities should with greater reason exist without a designer. In truth, however, people know that the kind of complexity they see in a camera is explained by an inventor, a designer. People also know that the complexity they see in an aeroplane is explained by an engineer. And by a fortiori analogy, many people infer that the resembling complexities in nature are explained by a greater designer. But where does the confusion lie in Dawkins' argument? To put our hands on that, we will have to be more specific about what we mean by complexity. Notice that complexity has been defined ambiguously. This ambiguity allows you to accept without hesitation that God is complex, even supremely complex. But what Dawkins fails to mention is that he is speaking about one of two different meanings of complexity. He should have clarified what exactly he means by complexity. After all, not all the meanings of complexity can be applied to God. Certain meanings of complexity apply only to the world and not to its designer. Dawkins should have distinguished that meaning from the meaning which applies universally. Secondly, Dawkins does not know which meaning of complexity it is that calls for a designer. Had he correctly identified that meaning and realized that it exists in this world, he would have appreciated why this world is designed. Additionally, he would have known that that meaning does not exist in the designer. This is because he would then have to know by necessity that the designer is not designed, and that he is void of that meaning on which the designed nature of this world is predicated. Otherwise, Dawkins would run into an impossible regress of causal explanations, where every designer is made by a designer, or into an impossible circular dependency, where the designer is made by his creation. The third option, an uncreated designer, is inevitable for anyone who knows that this world is designed.